Thanks. Thanks so much. I think we've got 1 minute to go, but I think we can start now. So good afternoon, LIASA colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to our second RETIG webinar for this year. And today's webinar promises to be very engaging and an interesting topic that's going to be presented. The topic of today's webinar is what is ChatGPT and large language models? Is it generative or derivative? We are privileged to have Sarah Brumfield from the USA as our speaker today. As you know, ChatGPT has taken the library and the academic world by storm in recent times, and it brings with it many benefits as well as challenges. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that today. I'm now going to hand you over to Marupeni Ramabina, who is the RETIG chair-elect, and he's going to be introducing our speaker in more detail. Just before I hand over to him, just to make everybody aware, this webinar is being recorded from, start to finish. And then after the event, the link to the recording and the presentation slides will be sent to everyone. So if you're not able to stay for the full webinar, or you have other commitments or connectivity issues, then you will be able to catch up on that recording. And while Sarah is speaking, I think it's best, as with other webinars, that we leave the questions or comments till the end of the webinar, but please, while the presentation is going on, if you can, or just make sure, please, that you are muted, and any questions or comments, just put them in the chat, and then Marupeni and I will look at the chat, and we will then allow for questions afterwards. So over to you, Marupeni. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll switch off my video. Good afternoon, colleagues. From our side here, thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, colleagues, for coming to our webinar today. My name is Marupeni Ramabina, the chair-elect of our interest group, RETIG. I work at the Northwest University in the Vaal. Yes, ChatGPT, my colleague yesterday, she said it's the new kid on the block. And then she told me that it was launched sometime late last year. So we'll hear about it from our speaker. Thank you everyone for coming to our session. We are starting our webinar at 3 p.m. Usually we start at 12 midday South African time. Today we are starting at 3 p.m. because our speaker, she's somewhere in the US. I think on her side, maybe it's 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. She will tell us.
Yes, 8 a.m. Austin, Texas.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Our speaker for today, colleagues, Sarah Brumfield. She is the sound engineer, also library and digital humanities consultant. Sarah is the co-creator of From the Page, which is a crowd sourcing platform where libraries, archives, and museums share documents for transcription. Prior to founding the From the Page, Sarah spent 17 years as a sound software engineer with IBM, where they were inventing and co-inventing the 8 patents. Sarah has a BA in computer science and the study of women and gender from Rice University in Houston, Texas. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us, and you can take over.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Leanne and Maripini, for arranging this. I'm mostly thrilled to be here because it gave me an excuse to do a really deep dive into ChatGPT and to think really hard about how to explain it to people and to talk to people about it and to synthesize everything I had been reading and to have an excuse to go read a whole lot more. So today we're going to talk about understanding ChatGPT for libraries and archives. We're going to start with what it is and how it works. And we're going to talk about different modes for interacting with ChatGPT. And then I think it's important to talk about lying, attribution, and copyright, because that comes up a lot. And I want you to understand kind of where things are now and what it means. And then we're going to talk about what it means for libraries, librarians, archives, special collections. That part, I don't know. I'm making that up. I have some ideas and some prompts. So I think we'll have a good conversation after I introduce a lot of this and bring up some of the questions that we all should be thinking about, because this is so new and it's moving so fast. I do have a handful of exercises that I'm going to throw in as I talk. And at the end, I have a link to some resources, some of the resources I used to build this talk, but it also has an exercises section for you. This isn't a workshop, it's just a talk, but you might want to go do some of those exercises so that you are more fluent and more familiar with the concepts that we're talking about. So why me? So as Maripini said, I have a BA computer science. That's over 25 years ago, but I also have a degree in humanities. So I love the combination of thinking and writing and reading as well as technology and combining those. That's where my sweet spot is. I've been a library and digital humanities consultant for about 7 years. My partner and I do a lot of projects around digital editions, IIIF, if you're familiar with that standard. And we also run From the Page. From the Page is our crowdsourcing platform. We have about 100 different institutions who run projects on it, for transcription, for metadata description, for some photo identification projects. So people do a lot of different things on From the Page, but because it's a crowdsourcing platform, we think hard about the human and the technology, right? We write technology, we're software engineers, but we're writing a platform that humans, that people, often retirees who are very, very passionate about history and genealogy and local history, are participating in partnering with institutions to turn digital images into searchable text. So I try to bring that empathy that we apply to our software engineering to thinking about how something like ChatGPT will affect all of us. I loved this cartoon on the right because I'm not an expert in AI. I took one class in college 30 years ago, but I do have a good technical grounding, and I went and I've, since this kind of has hit the zeitgeist, I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. So you don't have to assume that everything I say is 100% correct. I would encourage you to go do your own research and do your own teaching, but I'm confident in the things that I'm bringing to you, and I will tell you when there's pieces that I haven't managed to wrap my head around, because it's some really complicated technology. ChatGPT and large language models and AI in general, they're a big deal. They're going to change everything again. And I loved this quote from Bill Gates, because I'm like, it's going to change things like the web browser change things. And he's like, no, it's going to change things like, the microprocessor and the personal computer and the internet and the phone changed things. So I think it's important to know that it's a big deal. It's going to change things a lot. It's going to take a while to see how it's going to change things, but don't ignore it, because it's not going to go away, and it is going to have a lot of effect. There's a lot of whiz-bangery out there showing you how amazing ChatGPT is. It is, and it isn't. Like, the first couple of things that you see and you play with, you're like, wow, this is amazing. How is it doing this? And then you start running into the limitations and you're like, okay, well, this is kind of boring, right? So I think you have to kind of balance those two things. And we'll talk about kind of understanding how these large language models work in a deeper way so that you can understand what it might be good at and what it isn't good at. There's also a lot of really negative press out there talking about how it's sentient. It isn't. How it will seek power. It doesn't. And how it will put many of us who write words or write programs out of jobs. It won't, mostly. It will probably make us more efficient, and that will change the equation of how things work. There's a lot of people out there, and this is a very classic kind of marketing technique for technology, who are using fear, uncertainty, and doubt to sell you their ideas or sell you their products. I think just recognizing that and asking yourself, is this making me feel fearful? If this is someone saying, all jobs are going away. Okay, yeah, that's hyperbole, and let's not believe that. But it becomes more reasonable sometimes when they're like, well, copywriters are going away. Which, it's interesting. Then you have to ask yourself, well, what type are going away? And how do I become the person who doesn't lose my job? Or how does my job change? Or how can I use this tool to change my job so that I'm more effective and more efficient? So I'm hoping that this presentation will give you a good basis for wading through all the information that's out there, for gut checking what you read. The thing to realize is that this field is moving really, really fast. Things changed as I was writing this, and I've only been writing it for about a week. And this presentation is going to generate more questions than it answers. I'd also say it's okay if you disagree with me on how I'm looking at things, because that's what we need. We need a good civil discourse about what this technology means, what its implications are. I tend to be a techno-optimist. I think technology is generally for the good. And I know that that's not really a popular perspective right now. So you can take what I say with a grain of salt. But you can't stop a moving train. Like, this is happening and you're not going to be able to stop it or get in front of it. You just have to kind of hop on. Okay, so what is ChatGPT? ChatGPT is what we call a large language model. I'll go into that in a lot more details. It's generative AI, which means it generates stuff, right? It comes up with answers, in this particular case, text. It's trained on billions of words. So it's trained on words, right? This isn't about anything but words, ChatGPT in particular. There are some large language models that are trained on words and images, words and music, things like that. But ChatGPT is words. A friend was like, yeah, I think of it as autocomplete on steroids. And I've run into that a lot. And this is actually the simplest metaphor for understanding ChatGPT, is autocomplete on steroids. It will finish sentences, finish thoughts, and more than just finish, to kind of generate thought, and not thoughts, but generate sentences, generate paragraphs. ChatGPT and other large language models, they're actually really expensive to build, because there's a lot of data that goes in and then is processed and processed and processed and processed in order to build a model that's, we'll go into this more, but based on statistics that can help you, help the computer figure out what is the words that come next. So that's kind of useful to know when you hear people talk about AI not being, green or eco enough or things like that. It's because the process of doing the training is really computer expensive. It takes a lot of processors. You'll hear people bandy around words like GPUs, graphic processors. That's what people use for game design or playing games, right? You need your games to respond really quickly, so you have beautiful graphics. Those same processors are what's being used to do all this number crunching, and it takes many, many, many of them to do this. It doesn't cost nearly as much to run these models once they've been built. So, the basic model is you ask it a question. So I'm like, what is Lyasa, right? Y'all who I'm talking to, I actually wish I had asked about RETIG because I don't know what that stands for. And you ask a question. We call these questions prompts, and ChatGPT returns with text. So That's kind of at the core, kind of the interaction. So there's kind of two pieces here. One is chat. So the interface is ask a question or put in a prompt, get an answer, and you can go back and forth and say, well, can you tell me more? Or that's not the Lyasa I was talking about. Is there another one? Things like that. And so it has a chat style interface. So instead of clicking on a search result or, reading a series of posts, you get a chat interface. That's the chat part of ChatGPT. The GPT part is actually, it's actually GPT-3 or GPT-4. Those are the large language models that are behind this chat interface. So I think of ChatGPT as a cocky teenager. It thinks it knows everything. And in reality, it only knows what it's already encountered in the world. So in other words, for a large language model, it's what it's been trained on. It can reason based on what it knows, but it can't generate knowledge. So my first exercise that I would challenge you to do when you get done with this talk is to go play 20 questions with ChatGPT, this kids game, right? Where you have some object that you're holding in your head and someone is asking you questions about it and you answer. And then hopefully by the end of the 20 questions, they can figure out what you're talking about by maybe before the end of the 20 questions. I did this with ChatGPT with a bottle of champagne was what I was thinking about. I don't know why. It didn't get it right at all. And I realized how much context we as humans have, the knowledge that we have. If I was playing this with my kids, they would happen to know that I really like sparkling wine, and they would ask me questions about where it is in our house and our kitchen, and they would know the types of things that would normally be there. And ChatGPT doesn't have that knowledge about me, about my house. So where things are going to actually get more fun and more interesting as this world moves ahead and gets more complicated, but more useful, is when we start combining knowledge bases, very specific knowledge bases, with these large language models. So it's not so much that the large language models need a lot more information, because we've kind of shoved a whole bunch already in, but that it needs something, a person, a computer, a librarian, to tell it, this is the knowledge you need to pay attention to for this problem you're trying to solve. For this prompt, use this knowledge that we know about, because that will start telling it, this is the direction that I want you to go with your answers. So let's talk about what it's been trained on. So the ChatGPT 3 model has been trained on 300 billion words, which is a lot. 570 gigabytes of data. Those words are this training set that exists in the AI community, and it's generally made up of the open web. So, Wikipedia, all of Wikipedia is in there. Reddit, a lot of Reddit is in there, but also just all the texts that we've been typing online. That's been about 30 years worth of publishing things online is part of what's crawled and used for building this model. Now, there are problems with that. When you stop and you think of who uses the internet, who's been writing things online for 30 years. I have, because I live in North America. I had access to the internet starting my freshman year of college in 1993. This is before the web, right? This is Usenet and email. And, so when you look at internet use, and this is all from this article that I link at the bottom, 78% of people in North America use the internet. Only 20% of people in sub-Saharan Africa do. So already you have a very strong geographic bias. When you look at Wikipedia, only less than 15% of Wikipedians are women. So you've got a gender bias there. Reddit, I don't know how much time any of you spend on Reddit, but I've never posted on Reddit. I do occasionally read things on Reddit, but Reddit contributors are very, very white, and 64% of them are under the age of 30. So if you wonder sometimes why ChatGPT may sound like, a cocky teenager, that might be part of it. Probably not all of it. It's part of just how the model works, but I do think there's some human reasons that it sounds that way too. But of course, it works. Like, it's really, really good at facts, because there's a lot of facts on the internet. So this is from OpenAI's research paper about ChatGPT. So ChatGPT was developed by OpenAI, and they ran a bunch of kind of standard tests. These are kind of standard tests in the US through it, and had their results graded, and they were really good. Like, I love this one, the tall one that's about 4 in. I don't know whether you can see my cursor here or not. Uniform bar exam. That's what lawyers pass in order to be able to practice law in the US. And, it's hitting 90%. I have a high schooler who's been taking what we call AP, which are college credit classes. You take a test at the end of the class and you earn college credit from that. Yeah, her environmental science class, which she's taking right now, this model does like 90%. One of the first things she did when we started playing with this is she took one of the essay prompts from her AP English class last year, and it was about the significance of the green light in The Great Gatsby. And ChatGPT put out a very, very competent high schooler level essay for that prompt. So it is useful to know that this works. Like, it can generate text that answers questions with facts, especially, very, very well. Okay, so it's not just ChatGPT. That's kind of what we're focusing on in this talk, but there's a lot of other large language models out there. This is one that I'm kind of watching because it's more open than ChatGPT. So the instructions that it's used to make decisions are open. You can go look at them. You can modify them if you're a coder, and you can, take it in your own direction, or you can figure out how it got the answers it did, sort of, maybe, right? This is why this stuff is really hard, is the sort of maybe part. But there's other ones. Some big names to understand are Hugging Face. Why they named it that, I don't really understand, but is one of the big players in this world. Google Bard came out very recently, and I think it's worth watching because I think Google has some of the best data out there. When you think about what are you training these models on, I think Google has a lot more than many other people do. A lot of the other tech players are all working on their own, large language models that maybe they'll use with a chat interface, or maybe they will use in other ways. It's not just text, though, and it is sort of text, because a lot of these large language models really are based on language. But anything that depends heavily on or can be described by text, we're seeing solutions that are based on the same technology. So a popular one is voice-to-text transcription. I have a friend who every time she has a Zoom meeting, she joins the Zoom meeting, but a technology called Otter AI also joins the Zoom meeting, and it listens and it transcribes what's going on and then provides her with notes of the meeting when it's done. So that's two pieces, right? You kind of are using textual prediction, this autocorrect on steroids, and voice recognition to put together this summary or your notes from a meeting. OpenAI also has a service called Whisper AI, which I'm super excited about for the library and specifically the special collections world. So our friends at the University of North Texas Library used Whisper AI on a bunch of archival audio. In particular, they had a collection of sermons given by a minister, and 400 hours or something of this, maybe it was more, I actually should go check my notes. And they used Whisper AI to transcribe each of those sermons, and it did a really good job. And they were 40, 50-year-old recordings, so you all know how bad those can be. And they're, it's not like someone speaking into a microphone for the purpose of recording. It was someone giving a sermon in a church and happening to record it as well. So I think that has a ton of potential for making video and audio resources more and more accessible. We're also seeing image to text transcription. So I don't know how many of you have iPhones, and if you take a picture of a page in a book or a page of notes, it'll give you the little yellow wrapper around it. and you can copy and paste that in, and it gives you, what we think of as OCR, but a lot of what's behind that OCR is not traditional OCR, it's model-based OCR. Our friends at Transcribus is an Austrian company that grew out of some university work, and they train models on a corpus of text. So perhaps one writer or one era, and you transcribe it on something like From the Page. We actually have a call with them right after we get done with this to talk about improving our pipelines of taking transcribed text from the page, feeding it to Transcribus. They build a model based on that text, and then they can look at a page that's similar to this and do what we think of as OCR on it, except we call it HTR, handwritten text recognition. There's also services that use words and images together. So they get descriptions of images, and then when you put in a prompt, they can generate an image based on that prompt. So Stable Diffusion, Midjourney are two of the big ones there. You've probably seen some of this around because they're pretty, which makes it much easier to share and talk about. I'm also seeing, and this is kind of fascinating, music generation. So OpenAI, the same company that does ChatGPT, has a project called Jukebox. And if you really want to understand the limitations of these models, you should go listen to some of this stuff. I'm from Texas. I happen to like country music. And this first one there, it's terrible. Like, I had to turn it off after a couple of seconds because it grated on my ears, because there's so much kind of encoded in how we write music. It's more than being able to predict what the next note is, because there's a lot of repetition and patterns, and these models so far are not very good at that. And really, when I think about these models, they're very good at looking forward, what comes next. They're not nearly as good at looking backwards and saying, oh, is it time for the chorus? What was the chorus? Those sort of questions and those kind of models, it's not as good at. One of the interesting things that you see when you start just looking around is you can give ChatGPT a prompt and ask it to end a sentence in a particular word, or in a word in a particular letter, and it can't do it. It can't hold that context in its head by the time it gets to the end of what it's generating. Okay. Let's breathe. This is a very dense talk. I'm gonna have a sip of water, and then we're gonna talk about how ChatGPT works. So it's important to understand, at least at a high level, how these large language models work. So when you understand, they're less scary. They're less inscrutable, right? They're not a black box. So I mentioned earlier that they're autocomplete on steroids. Let's dig into that a bit. Okay, this is a visualization that we love from the page. It's called a word tree visualization, and there are great things to do with transcribed text. So this particular example is built from the George Washington financial papers, and our friends there were the ones who introduced us to this visualization, and we were kind of blown away by how powerful it is. The George Washington financial papers are the financial records of George Washington's plantations, and so you can feed all that text into this visualization, and then you give it a root word, and it shows you here every word that comes after that root word. And each word that comes after is, how big it is on this tree has to do with how often it shows up. The more often it shows up in this sequence, the larger it will be. So it's kind of very easy to understand from this tree that Miss Bishop was a midwife, and that she was paid, this is the financial papers, by the plantation for delivering babies. And you can kind of see a lot about how often this happened, and all of this was is there, and it's interesting just to watch and to see this. And when you put this whole corpus in, you actually see that, like, the two biggest expenses, midwives were one of them, shoes were another one. So it's a fun visualization. I'm going to use it to explain how these large language models work. Okay, so this is a word tree of the book of Genesis. ChatGPT is based on statistics. It guesses the next word in a sequence. So if we look at it, if we imagine a model based on the Bible or the book of Genesis, maybe, now let's go with the Bible. The prompt in or in the could lead to in the beginning or in the reign of so-and-so or in the time so-and-so. And each of those would have a certain statistical probability, right, that they would show up in the text. In the beginning shows up once. So if you were ChatGPT and someone said, you know, based on Genesis, finish the sentence, in the, you probably wouldn't say beginning, because it would be very small in this visualization, right? It would be one of those bottom words there. It turns out that in the time shows up a whole lot. So this is, and actually in this case, this is a word tree that's been trained on or visualizes the book of Genesis. In the, turns out land, in the land of Cana is one of the most common phrases, is the most common use of those words. So that's kind of the basics. Every word has a statistical probability of appearing next in a sequence. But of course, it's more complicated than that. So after you guess the first word, what these models do is you take your prompt and you take the answer to your first word that is the answer to your thing, and you feed all of that back in. And you're like, now what's the next word? So we had in, and we guessed the, because it was statistically the most significant one. And then after the, our answers, you know, the next thing in the could be land or field or earth or morning. These are, it's like rolling a die. You don't always pick the most common one, but you weigh the most common one. So it has a higher probability of showing up as your next word. So it doesn't always pick land. Sometimes it will pick morning. But because if you pick morning in the morning, and then you take that and you feed it back into the model, you'll never get Egypt as your next word. Because in the morning, Egypt doesn't follow the tree, right? In the morning, you'll get probably and or some of these teensy tiny words that we can't even read on our screenshot. So it's a probabilistic guess at what is the next word based on the prompt plus the words that we've said so far. All that together, put it in the model, say which one comes next. But of course, it's more complicated than that. So it's not actually word for word. It pulls out important terms from the input, from your prompt, and it weighs those next words so that so the ones that are closer to your important words are weighed heavier, right? They get bigger on our word tree, and we're using that as our metaphor. So in this case, I asked it to, if we imagine that our corpus of words was not just the book of Genesis or even the Bible, but the whole internet, because now we're back to ChatGPT. And we told the model that Genesis and King James Bible was important, we'd get something like this, you know, almost a word for word beginning of the book of Genesis. It obviously pulled this straight, pulled out Genesis and King James Bible and pulled this straight from there. But what I thought was interesting, it also identified the word beginning and the word story as keywords, which is not what I was thinking immediately. I was just like, okay, well, let's see what we can get this to do. So the words that are close to beginning and story in Genesis and King James Bible, each of those probably as separate terms, are the ones that are going to be weighed more heavily on our statistical probability of what our next word is. So you get something that looks a whole lot like the beginning of the story of creation from the book of Genesis out of the King James Bible. So pretty interesting, but let's let you start doing some really interesting things by combining important terms. So I said, write Cinderella in the style of the book of Genesis in the King James Bible. And this is where it starts looking like magic, right? We couldn't model this in our word tree because we can't visualize how the word Cinderella and, Book of Genesis, King James Bible, how those two things we don't really reconcile in our head. They have nothing to do with each other. But the model is humongous. This word tree that we've been using, yeah, now multiply that. It's a vector space. It's this great big cube of things that are all related and have statistical probabilities. And it can produce text like this, which I actually was kind of charmed by, because it's very much in the style of the Old Testament, and it is very much the Cinderella story. But of course, it's more complicated than that, even. So this is actually the limitations that are at the end of the ChatGPT paper on OpenAI. And what you realize when you read these and you read the paper, you start thinking about what else they do to kind of start nudging our tree. How do you make certain words bigger and certain words smaller? And they do this in a couple of ways. They take an existing text and they feed the beginning of it into the model and they say, what's the next word, model? And if the model gets the answers where the model gets it right, the probability goes up a little tiny bit. They nudge the model, so it's more likely to answer that way. The times that the model gets it wrong, they nudge those down a little bit. So that's one way that they're kind of tweaking this model. They're feeding it all these kind of rules that say this is actually worth more than this other answer that you gave me. And then they also have humans rate answers. So they ask the model a question, and then they have real life humans look at it and rate certain answers as better than others. And that nudges those answers up in the probability and the other ones down. I actually loved the third bullet here. It says, the model is excessively verbose and overuses certain phrases. These issues arise from biases in training data because trainers prefer longer answers that look more comprehensive. I mean, I think of this as kind of BS, but that seems to be a human trait that we like longer answers rather than concise answers. They also use human trainers to make the model less toxic, less racist. Like, we know that the internet can be very toxic, can be racist, can be sexist. And so, and if you published a model that was kind of that modeled that purely, people would probably be upset. So they use moderation and human trainers to nudge the model away from those, or perhaps to just rule out some of those answers completely. I don't know exactly how they do this. So those are kind of the way this model works. In the resources that I'll provide afterwards, I've got a couple of articles and a video that explains it. So if you want to go deeper, there's more because it's very complicated. But if you have this in your head, then I think have enough to start evaluating answers and to evaluate claims people are making about these models and see whether they match your understanding of how it works and kind of whether it passes your threshold for BS or not. Okay. So are these models generative or derivative? These large language models are called generative because they generate responses to a prompt, right? If we go back to the autocomplete metaphor and we think about, I use Gmail, probably a lot of you use Gmail, how Gmail has started finishing sentences for you or correcting your sentences for you. I find that when I let it make those changes, my writing is less pithy, it loses my style, doesn't have my voice, and it gets longer and more boring. So when my family started playing with ChatGPT, my husband and partner Ben put in prompts about, tell me a story about an astronaut and a dinosaur. And we had many, many different variations on that prompt because we were trying to see what the model would do and how it would work. Every single time the astronaut's name was Tom. And every time the dinosaur and the astronaut became friends. It was very, very stereotypical, and it was boring. So it was fascinating that you could get it to write a story. But once you got past the fact that it was writing a story for you, it kind of got boring really fast. So very stereotypical outputs. What we tend to say, or what I've heard said about these models, is ChatGPT can write in the style of Shakespeare, but it can never be Shakespeare. When you stop and you think about all the words and the phrasing that Shakespeare came up with, and oh my gosh, there's so much. I saw this mural once in person, and I had to go find it for this talk, because you don't realize how many of the phrases that we use. Wild goose chase is a Shakespearean phrase. Dead as a doornail. All of these things, ChatGPT can never come up with them. Now that they exist and they're in the world and they're in the training data that's used to build ChatGPT, it can use them, but it wouldn't put together these disparate terms in a way that catches our imagination and becomes part of our vernacular. So I don't like the phrase generative. I really think that these models are derivative, and that derivative is a better word to use. Okay, another pause. Okay, we've got 4 ways I want to talk about interacting with ChatGPT. So just because ChatGPT is derivative doesn't mean it isn't useful, right? So you have to understand its limitations, but now let's talk about how we interact with ChatGPT. So let's start with, what is a prompt and prompts? So a prompt is just a set of words, a question, a paragraph of text, a question plus 4 different bullet points. It's words that you ask of these models. So when I started writing this presentation, Stable Diffusion, which is one of the prompt to image models, they actually generated images for you for free, but they sold you access to their prompt database. They changed that. So I thought that was fascinating, because this is moving so fast. So for a while, prompt writing as a concept was seen as a very valuable thing, and I think it still is. I think learning to write prompts is something that is going to be an interesting skill. It's not something I'm particularly good at. I'm an engineer. I'm a realist, and I don't use nearly enough description when I'm trying to write prompts. So for me, what I do is when I run into something interesting that I'm like, oh, that's a good model, I should use that sometime. I actually have a spell book. I call it my spell book of prompts to use with ChatGPT and other systems like this. One of my exercises that I have for you later is to go and search and browse the Stable Diffusion prompt, because you can see the types of prompts people who are enthusiastic and creative and are spending hours working on, like what they're putting in and what you're getting out, just very technical descriptions. The second one here, I'm pretty sure, ISO 200 and XF IQ4, no clue what that is, but I think if I was a photographer, I might know, right, what people are putting in and getting out of these models. So I think that people who perhaps write and are trained to write descriptive metadata, or people who help other people formulate research questions, does it sound like anyone you know, might be very good at writing prompts. I think you should take your training and think about how it applies to this world, and then hopefully go teach people how to do this better, right? I also think vocabulary is a really important skill for prompt writing. When you think about, autocorrect on steroids, the words that you use are very important. And I think we all know that the best way to build your vocabulary is just to read a lot. So I don't think our fundamental, skills and intelligence and verbalness of our world changes. In fact, I think words get more important. I think we think differently about how to use those words, because this is going to give us a new kind of model to use in our brain, which is, how do I ask a question of a computer that thinks this way? I think it's interesting, and I've got a couple points in the exercises to like think about dimensionality. So I've asked when I do prompts, more, can you make that less formal? Can you make that more formal? Can you make it more polite? Can you use alliteration? Can you be less stereotypical? And see what those types of words get you for prompts. So this is the way most people are interacting with these systems right now, is just a prompt, ask, put some words in, get something out. One of the ways that I really like using ChatGPT, this is actually the most useful way of using ChatGPT for me so far, is as a starting point. So at From the Page, we send out 2 newsletters every month, and we're usually pretty good at like, okay, which collections of work to be transcribed are we going to talk about this month? So the newsletter actually that's going out today has 2 collections. One is cemetery internment cards, and another one is marriage certificates. These collections don't have a lot in common, but we, the humans, were like, okay, what about a theme of till death do us part? Because we get marriage and we get death. Okay, that works. And so my teammate Anna wrote this prompt, and introduction to a newsletter with a theme till death do us part. It features cemetery internment cards and marriage certificates. Mentioned that it's kind of morbid. I think there was a little bit more in there than that, but what it gave her was enough to get over writer's block, right? It gives you a starting point. Now, the starting point needed fact checking. 2 things were completely wrong. And it was only as good as the prompt that we put in. We put a lot of creative work into coming up with the prompt and thinking about what we wanted in this, but then it gave us the paragraph to start working with. And what it produced, I don't actually have here, but was very decent. And then it took a lot less time for us to take that decent output and turn it into something that we could be proud of. So I think of this as kind of the starting point model. It's the same as putting stuff in as a prompt, but realizing that you're not just trying to answer a question, you're trying to, give yourself a starting point to take off from. We also do a newsletter that we talk about different aspects of transcription and crowdsourcing and editing scholarly editions, especially digitally. And so we had this one where my partner Ben had been interviewed. He was at the very tail end of COVID. He was not very coherent. And the interview was just transcribed for a paper or a publication. And it's really kind of wordy and it's not very well structured, right? There's some really good ideas in it, but it's not well structured. So I asked ChatGPT, rewrite this as a newsletter instead of as an interview. And it gave me one answer, which I actually thought was pretty good, but it was not quite the tone that we like. So then I said, can you do it more informally, please? And then it got too informal, but between the 2 of these, we were able to put together a starting point that only took about 10 minutes of editing in order to get a newsletter that we sent out. Now, we couldn't have done it without the input, right? The input is where Ben's thoughts, with a lot of facts that he knows because of what we've done, and his tone of voice and things. And that's what let us do these variations. And then we still had to do editing at the end. But I think this whole starting point concept is good, because if you were to teach students that, because they're going to be using this, right? It's only as good as what you put into it. And you've got to do editing and fact checking on the other end. Okay, let's talk about another model. So this is a model called co-piloting. So there is one of the early, really practical and commercial applications of these large language models is something called GitHub Copilot. And it's an assistant as you code. So GitHub is, if you don't know, it's this great big repository of tons and tons of code projects, and like we check stuff into it every day. Every time we make a change, you push it up to GitHub because it's your safe place to keep it. And it has all these tools that help you find things and share things and all of this. So they've built a large language model based on all of this code in GitHub. And then in this example here, you can see the comment at the very top, write a binary search algorithm. That's the prompt. And then you get something, you start typing your functionality, and all of this stuff in light gray is the autocomplete. It's the suggestion. And the suggestion is then what you can, decide to use or not, because you still have to review it and think about it. But I think this model of co-piloting is really, really powerful. We're seeing people talk about pulling this into the Microsoft Office suite. Google is talking about using it in their Google Docs and their other online productivity tools. Imagine right-clicking, selecting a paragraph, right-clicking and saying summarize this, or give me the key points, or quiz me. So my partner just told me I only have 10 minutes left, and I'm only about halfway through, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So one of the other models that I think is really fascinating is chatbots. So this is taking ChatGPT, but surfacing knowledge to answer a question and feeding that knowledge into ChatGPT. So this is a whole bunch of newsletters. You ask a question, it searches the newsletters for relevant pieces, feeds those relevant pieces into ChatGPT along with your question, and then returns answers, and then also tells you which newsletters it pulled things from. I'm actually planning on doing a chatbot like this with a summer intern this summer based on a transcribed historical collection that we have on from the page. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it works. Okay, so should you worry? So I'm not that worried, but I'm an adult who, I write and I do these things as to achieve some end. If I was teaching, I would spend a lot of time thinking about how to restructure this. But I do think you have to either start with a lot of original thought and creativity, or you have to finish with a lot of original thought and creativity. It's going to devolve into a garbage in, garbage out situation. So those of us who can do quality in, whether that's prompts or feeding it context like notes, quotes, ideas, and titles, will get quality out. And it's going to make those of us who can bring that original thought and creativity into play even more creative, because it kind of takes care of all the boring parts. But I do think teaching is going to become harder. Okay, let's talk about lying, attribution, and copyright. So we were visiting my sister in Switzerland over Christmas, and I asked ChatGPT, what are good things to do in Bern in the winter? And one of the answers was, go see the bears. I'm like, cool. There are bears in Bern, and I did some traditional and kind of Google-based research, learned there have been bears in Bern since the 1500s, that you can take a tour of the historic bear pits, and that the newer, more humane bear preserve, and that bears hibernate in the winter, and it's closed. So my emotional response to this was similar to if a person had lied to me. ChatGPT doesn't try to be right. It tries to be plausible. So I kind of dug a little bit deeper into this and thought, how is this different from a Google search? So Google isn't an authority. It sends me to others it's identified as an authority. And then I decide based on a lot of factors like the wording, the context, the site design, the domain, the brand recognition, how trustworthy that source is. So when TripAdvisor tells me it's not open in winter, I trust it. Attribution, right? There's a lot of calls for attribution or auditing of answers in these large language models. I don't think it's as easy as people assume it is. If you think back to the word tree metaphor for statistical weighing what comes out, to effectively audit something like that, you'd have a list of documents that weighted each of those words, and every single word would have a different list. It's going to be very, very hard to do. We are seeing some tools like this one called Find. This is a code search, which displays attribution, but I kind of think it's lying. I think it's doing the same thing the chatbot model was doing, where it's pulling out relevant things and then feeding that in as a prompt, and then it'll show you those relevant things. I do think we could do some reverse engineering where you take the answers that are coming out and then web searching those answers and then seeing what sources are returned from that. And maybe that's a sort of attribution, but it's not really, right? So I think this is really hard. It's going to be hard to do attribution. It's going to be hard to do auditing. It's going to be a special case thing. So yeah, that's kind of BS. Copyright, and this is all US based copyright law. I suspect the Commonwealth would be very similar, but in the US, there's been currently 2 cases where people are suing the AI companies for copyright infringement. This is specifically around the image generation. The arguments hinge on fair use and whether the results generated by the AIs are transformative or derivative. You know what I think about that already, but in 2000, so here's some of the background, right? In 2005, publishers sued Google for indexing copyrighted books and then surfacing snippets in search results. It took 10 years to decide that case, and judges decided that in similar cases, that answering questions and showing snippets was actually transformative. So, case law says this type of use is transformative. The Getty is one of the plaintiffs in the 2 current suits around image generation. And they claim that these image generation models were trained on their corpus without licensing or permission. But they also say that only some of the images generated by the image models are derivative. So who gets to decide? Like, this is going to be hard. I think one of the key questions is who owns the results? The creators of the input? The people who built the model? The person who came up with the right prompt? Interesting question, right? I love creators. I love reading books. I love looking at art. I love the work creators do. I also love innovation and open data and the Creative Commons. I know that the law doesn't understand technology very well. I also know that technology moves faster than the law can keep up with. We know that national borders can't really contain online resources. So I think we're going to see pretty lax laws for a while. And I think that's actually okay, because I want to see what this technology can do. And I want to move fast and see what the innovation happens. And I know not all of you are going to agree with me on that. And that's okay. Okay. Let's talk about what this means, especially for libraries and librarians. I really don't know. So I'm hoping you guys have some thoughts on this, but I do have some prompts and some ideas. So the first thing I would do is figure out how to use ChatGPT to improve your productivity, especially on things that machines are better at than humans. So this is an example, it's in the resources, where our friend Deb Paul, who's with iDig Bio, put in some kind of dirty OCR output and then had ChatGPT go through, pull out the important terms, and then map it into Darwin Core. This is pretty impressive, because this is not something you want to do as a human, and you don't really want to write the program to do it as a human, and ChatGPT can just do it. So this is the sort of thing that we should all be doing, because it makes our lives a lot more fun and easier, and the computer does it better than we do. I ran into an article called The End of Organizing, and this is personal productivity. I take a ton of notes, I journal a lot, and people who think about personal productivity and organizing are always trying to come up with new ways to search all their notes or organize all their notes. And the reality is most of us don't go back very far and use our old notes. So the theory here was, we're going to feed all this into a large language model and it will just surface what we need when we need it. When you're writing a presentation on AI, it will find the quotes that you've pulled out and the notes that you made 5 years ago and all of this and just give it to you, which maybe is true, but I think there's still this question of how do you give the model the knowledge it needs for this context, for this question. And I think that's an interesting thing and place for libraries and information science to play, because I don't think everything is the answer. And I don't know that it's actually going to be the end of organizing. You probably figured out that I actually admire Bill Gates as a thinker on technology. He's been around for a long, long time. He's a really smart guy. This is from his article on AI and what it's going to do in our world. The world needs to make sure that everyone, and not just people who are well off, benefit from artificial intelligence. Governments and philanthropy will need to play a major role in ensuring that it reduces inequality and doesn't contribute to it. Many of you work for public institutions, you work for public libraries, you work for universities. So I think this is a part of your role and where we're going and what's coming here. I think you start by learning it yourself, and then you teach others and you think about the implications, you understand the limitations, and you talk about them. One of my last quotes is by Tom Scheinfeld, who's an associate professor of digital humanities at the University of Connecticut. I have a link to his talk on primary sources and AI and teaching in my resources. But I was really shocked to see this, because we have all worked really, really hard to make library and special collections and archival resources available freely. And like, I've had conversations about how do we get Google to index this sort of conversations. And he throws out this, which is, are we sure we want to make things freely available? Because what happens, and do we care what happens? And maybe we should care, because, I mean, we probably should care, but maybe we actually want archival resources and less represented voices to be pulled into these models, or maybe we want to build models off of them. So really interesting question on whether, you know, where you want your data to end up and what's the implications of where it ends up. So this I pulled from the newsletter that led to Leanne asking me to come speak to y'all today, thinking about antidotes to ChatGPT from an archives and special collections perspective in particular. I'm not going to read all this to you because we're pretty much at the end, and I want to give a little bit of time for questions, but there is a link to that whole article in the resources as well. So thinking about the data that you have that isn't in these models, and that takes actual reading and analysis by students to do things with it. So that's something I think that you should be thinking about. So we just started a newsletter on AI for libraries, archives, and museums. There's the bit.ly link for it there. You can email me, sarah@fromthepage.com. And then this link at the bottom is the one that you should try to write down, bit.ly.com, ChatGPT for archives resources. And I'll make sure that Maripeni has it when we send out, I'm not sure who's sending out the follow-up. Whoever is sending out the follow-up, I'll make sure they have that link to put directly in the email as well. So, okay, what time is it? It's a minute past the hour. So that was a lot of information. I'm happy to stay a little bit longer and answer questions. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much, Sarah, for a wonderful presentation. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and to investigate further for ourselves. And yeah, it's you really have covered the topic well, and I'm sure a lot of us will be contacting you and keeping in touch to find out a bit more. I'm going to now, we are at 2 minutes past 4 on my side. I'm just going to have a look at the chat and see if there are any questions as such. Let me just see. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to read all the comments because there's quite a lot, and it refers to earlier parts of your presentation. Let's see. Yeah, the more clear prompts you put in, that's from Teresa. Hopefully better output you get. And then she also said creative writing is another skill in the digital world to engage effectively with AI. Then Lucy said, as a search tool strategy, ChatGPT requires a user to do quality assurance because the information is vast. And Teresa just said, you can ask ChatGPT to provide sources where the information, if provided, comes from. Whether those are accurate or not, that's still something to think about. And then let's see if there are any questions, just lots of thank yous from everybody. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask any specific questions. You're welcome to raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'm just going to open the floor for anybody that would like to ask something or make a comment before we close. Oh, I see Lynn Kleinfeld has got her hand up. You're welcome to go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Sarah, for an informative presentation, and good day to everybody. Yes, there's certainly a lot to think about, and I'm so pleased that RETIG organized this event and the session this afternoon. It is a nice way following the very informal conversation we had earlier this year through an online coffee talk. So I'm quite pleased. I've learned quite a lot as well from your presentation. I actually just want to make a comment regarding the role of the library and librarians. I think here, once again, information literacy plays such an important role, because if we look at how and what we've learned today about how ChatGPT operates, it is clear that yes, you need to acquire the skills as a user of ChatGPT in terms of how you are creating your query to what you are actually receiving, what ChatGPT is giving back to you, and needing to evaluate that information and not just take it as face value. So once again, with a lot of the tools, as much as we it is there to assist, we still need to evaluate. We need to put the effort in as well. So that's my take on it, that as a user, as a student, and especially if you look at what it is crawling, Wikipedia, the open web, then it is questionable. And I think in our session earlier this year, we had this debate about how ChatGPT generates a reference list. You can ask it to generate it, but is it actually generating a correct, accurate reference list is questionable. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thanks so
that's the
much.
questions you have to figure out, right? I don't think it is. And I think there's lots of research to be done to figure out that, but yeah, I don't think we're there yet.
Absolutely, thanks.
Thanks so much, Lynn. I see that Sarah did indicate she has to be leaving soon for another meeting, because of course on her side it's the morning there, so she's still got the whole day ahead of her. I'm just going to check here in the chat. Just thank you very much. Okay, yeah.
I think the fears are the technology is being a threat to human existence. I think that's way overblown. I really do. Yeah, I think that's people making you fearful to push your buttons. Yeah, students evaluating existing information resources, how are they going to be able to evaluate ChatGPT? That's going to be a hard one. So, yeah.
If
Okay.
I may add, I found the writer's block and how it could possibly help one with that quite interesting, because I think a lot of us do experience that at some point in our lives, where we go through writer's block, and to maybe use it in that way to get one's writing and getting out of that writer's block, but using it properly, I think is most important. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Yes, just before we close, anybody who would like to perhaps engage further with Sarah, yeah, her contact details are in the presentation, which we will send you later. And of course, there's the recording as well. And I would suggest, if you do have further questions or comments, or you don't know, you just want to find out a bit more, you're welcome to contact her directly, and you know, and then she will get back to you. So I'm just going to check. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, I think because of the time and in view of the fact that Sarah has got to go to another meeting, I'm going to close the session now. So please do feel free to engage further with Sarah if you want to get answers to other questions that you may have. And yes, and we will send out the recording link and all the other information as soon as possible after this event. So thank you so much, Sarah, for your for accepting the invitation and for giving us so much to think about. And thank you, Marapeni, also for your assistance this you know, at the beginning. And also a big thank you to Afelele and Lebo at the Liasa office for their assistance in setting up the Zoom meeting for us. And thank you all for attending. It's been wonderful to see so many of you here today. So thank you so much, and yeah, wishing you all a wonderful weekend, and Sarah, a good day ahead for you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and goodbye to everyone.